Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Now, I spend a lot of time working with Chinese handheld devices, and most of these have been made over the past year or so. And I really enjoy the fact that there are these companies out there who are trying to kind of reclaim the nostalgia of older systems. But what if we actually just played around with an older system? The people behind My Retro Game Case offer a customized Game Boy Advance that they have modded themselves, using handcrafted tools, using an original Game Boy Advance. And I think this thing is really special. It's a mix of all that old school like 90s kind of feel, but then with some modern comforts built in. And I've had this device for about a month now, and I just can't put it down. I really enjoy this thing. And even though I have all these modern retro handheld devices, something about this one really interests me. And maybe it's because I never had a Game Boy Advance. But either way, let's dive into it with this video. Okay, let's talk about what's inside this thing. It runs a Raspberry Pi CM3, which is a 1.2 GHz CPU. It has a gig of RAM, and it runs RetroPie as its main operating system. It has a 3.5 OCA laminated IPS display with a 640 by 480 resolution and a 4:3 aspect ratio. It's exactly like the screen on an RG350M. It's perfect. It also has upgraded buttons, so it has an added PS Vita analog stick and then AB and XY buttons. It also has L2 and R2 buttons in the back, and we'll talk about those later. And probably one of the most unique features is that it actually charges two AA 3.7 volt batteries in the back of it. So you use the exact same battery compartment from before, but now you just plug it in with a micro USB slot to charge it, which means you can upgrade the batteries, replace the batteries, all that kind of stuff. That's pretty awesome. Now, the device costs $175, and that might seem like a lot, but think about the fact that it has an original Game Boy Advance, a Raspberry Pi 3, this new screen, these upgraded batteries, all the work that went into it, plus the first 30 orders on the website come with that beautiful wooden box as well. That's really a lot of work and items for $175. Okay, let's do a quick unboxing here. And I actually got two boxes in this shipment. One is the RGB 10 case, which I've already gone through and done the upgrade with. And then there's this one. And it comes with a micro USB charging cable. And then, like I mentioned before, the first 30 orders actually come with this beautiful case. And you can buy the case separately as well on their website. And it's magnetically sealed. It's really snug in there. It's really hard to describe what it's like to hold this thing. Thinking back, it's been probably about 20 years since I held a Game Boy Advance. I have such muscle memory of where the power button is and the headphone jack and the volume slider. All those things are like ingrained in me, right? And so it's just kind of amazing to hold this thing in my hands again, but then all of a sudden it's got an SD card slot and a micro USB charging port. And it has this fake little like Game Boy cartridge, which really fills me full of nostalgia. And you can see here, these are the rechargeable batteries. I think it's really incredible that they were able to reuse that space again for these batteries. And as you can see here, it has an SD card slot, and it just has a generic SD card inside. I'll probably end up swapping that out for something else in the future. So initially, I actually didn't even notice the L2 and R2 buttons on the back here. And they're kind of small and a little bit hard to push. But you have to think about the fact that he had to fit all of these extra components into an existing model like this. So I'm not really sure where else you could have put it. You either could just omit the shoulder buttons or then put them in like this. Okay, so let's turn it on and see what it's like inside. So I'm actually new to the whole Raspberry Pi and RetroPie thing. This is not something I've used before, but I am familiar with Emulation Station because it's available on the RG351 and other devices. So at the end of the day, I am actually pretty familiar with the interface, even though this is kind of new to me. There are no games loaded on this device. It actually just comes with one freeware NES game, but it's pretty easy to load them on. You just put the SD card in your computer and then load it all on. And you can see here, I've got everything going. So I'm just going to do a mixture of like gameplay as well as talking about some of the things I like about this device. Starting off with some of those easier systems. You know, Game Boy Advance is going to run perfectly on this. Game Boy, Nintendo, Genesis, all those just run perfectly. And they look beautiful on this 640 by 480 display. It's really a trip to think about, you know, the quality of the screen that used to be on a Game Boy Advance compared to what we're seeing here. Okay, moving on to harder systems, this does play PSP games, but what I found is that basically anything that requires 3D rendering is not going to play well on this. It's kind of a bummer, but at the same time, you know, you can play Lumines on a Game Boy Advance. Like, how crazy is that? One unfortunate thing is this is not the standalone PPSSPP emulator. This is actually the RetroArch core. and that's probably why some of the emulation is not very good. On top of that, some of the colors look washed out, like it's very contrasty when you're playing games like this. And that's not like that with every system, but it is for PSP for some reason. And like I mentioned before, 3D games just aren't going to work. You can see here with Wipeout on the PSP, it's just not playing. Maybe if you're like a sloth, this would be like super exciting to you, but to anybody else, this is no fun. And you can go into the settings and like adjust the frame skip and stuff like that, like you can see here with Outrun 2006, but it's really not worth it. It gets super choppy. In general, I think PSP is probably just mostly a no-go on this. Now, regular PlayStation runs just perfectly. Everything looks really sharp and clear, and it's just kind of amazing to have such a big, beautiful screen on an original Game Boy Advance like this. And you know, performance on the PS1 is so good on this, I thought I would try out the enhanced resolution option within the PS1 emulator. And you can see here it's running just great. Obviously, I'm not playing Tony Hawk very well, but it's running at a solid 60 frames per second, even with the enhanced resolution. So these PS1 games look even better than they originally did. This is becoming one of my favorite ways to play PlayStation games. Now, one thing I do want to bring up is the fact that the PS Vita analog stick sometimes gets in the way when you're using the D-pad. You can see here when you're trying to push on it, there's just not a lot of space there. Overall, if you have large hands, you're probably definitely going to feel the difference. I have medium-sized hands and I can definitely tell. And I've kind of changed the way I play just to kind of compensate for it. And same thing with the face buttons. Even though they're beautiful and they're like hand-sanded, they're just nice buttons. They're very close to one another. And I don't really think that's a bad thing, but it's just something to be aware of that I ended up playing this differently. I ended up using the tips of my thumbs as opposed to like my entire thumb when I'm pushing a button. And if you haven't held a Game Boy Advance in a while, it's a pretty small device, like it's made for smaller hands. So you can see when I'm cupping it, I actually can't wrap all 4 fingers around everything. So what ends up happening is my pinkies are just kind of hanging down at the bottom there. It's just something you kind of have to get used to. Even though the Game Boy Advance feels great in the hands, it's just not a perfect console. It's just a little bit small. There's a wide variety of systems that can work with this. I really just kind of stuck with the classics because it really seemed appropriate with this device in particular. But Sega 32X, things like that, they run just fine. It's funny, but the moment that I booted up Sega CD on this Game Boy Advance, I had like this kind of epiphany, right? It's so crazy to have Sega CD on a Nintendo product, an actual Nintendo product, playing a Sega game like that. And it kind of blew my mind. And obviously, as you can see here with Chicken's enthusiasm, it kind of blew her mind as well. You know, like both of us are just shocked to be able to play Sonic CD on a Game Boy Advance like this. It was just really kind of cool. I'm totally not just trying to show my cat off. Anyway, Sega CD games play just fine. You can see here with Sonic CD, it works great. And I've said it before, but it's really beautiful on the screen here. It's really nice. So I'm just using the default theme here, and there's probably a way to like, you know, have box art and things like that showing. Honestly, I just didn't do the work. I just wanted to try to put on the games and see what it played like. There's probably a lot more work I could do to kind of make this a better experience, but for now I'm pretty happy with how it works. And just like any of the other systems, Super Nintendo works just fine. You can see here with Mario RPG, it's running perfectly. But one thing I do want to make a note of is after about an hour of playing, I found that I would get a temperature indicator on the top right of my screen there. And I did a little bit of research, and basically it's saying that the CPU is overheating. Now that could be one of two things. One, it could just be some faulty wiring and maybe some sort of issue with that, or it might actually just really be heating up. And I think maybe the fact that there are 2 big batteries near the CPU might be causing some of those warmth issues. When I'm actually holding the device, it does get a little bit warm, but nothing beyond what I've seen with any other handheld device. If anything, I would say that this temperature indicator is just kind of annoying. It's nothing more than that. Okay, moving on to other systems, here's Final Burn Neo playing Street Fighter III Third Strike, and it's basically flawless performance. So any arcade fighting game, Neo Geo, anything else like that are going to play just great on this. And MAME performance was also similarly good. Here I'm running MAME 2003, and you can see the X-Men is playing just great. In general, arcade emulation across the board was really impressive. Okay, so now I want to spend a few minutes talking about Nintendo 64. And I don't know what it is about this Game Boy Advance, but to me, it seemed like the perfect little device to play Nintendo 64 games. It seems ideal for that. Now, unfortunately, performance is kind of hit and miss. You can see here with Wave Race 64, I'm getting about 10 frames per second, so I would consider this to be unplayable. But then Mario Kart plays at full speed. It runs beautifully. Now, one of the issues is that the L2 button is your item button, and like I mentioned before, it's kind of hard to push, and so it actually takes away from the kind of playing experience by having to have this button that's hard to reach. And it's a simple fix. You can actually just go into RetroArch and change the button mapping. But it is something I wanted to highlight, is that it's not a perfect setup. Games like Mario 64 play just beautifully. This Vita analog stick really is a lot of fun with this device. And honestly, I find myself using the Vita analog stick more than the D-pad because it doesn't get in the way of anything, right? The Vita stick gets in the way of the D-pad, but the D-pad doesn't get in the way of the analog stick. And so because of that, that becomes my preferred control scheme. Now, unfortunately, because there's not a second analog stick, there's no way to control the camera, so that may get in the way of your playing of Mario 64. Moving on to other games, you can see Mario Tennis definitely has some slowdown here. To me, it's a little too slow to be playable. And luckily, games like F-Zero, they play at full speed. It's really going to be a mixed bag. You just have to kind of play each game and see which one's going to work well for you. And finally, I tested both Zelda games and they both play really well. Given the fact that some 3D games like Wave Race 64 weren't playing very well, I was kind of worried about these Zelda games because I thought these were going to be perfect games to play on this device. And it turns out they played just wonderfully. Okay, so before we start wrapping up, let me just show off a little bit more of the hardware here. Now these buttons, like I mentioned before, are sand polished. They feel really nice. They have a little bit of grippiness to them, and they're a perfect size. Like, they're a little bit big. I'm so used to having these tiny little buttons. I love how big they are. The D-pad is somewhat small, but it's the original D-pad. That's just how it used to be. But it's responsive. It feels good. It feels like a Nintendo D-pad. And unfortunately, although the analog stick is wonderful, it does get in the way of the D-pad. And what I had to do when I was playing is adapt the way that I hold it. And you can see here I just used the tip of my thumb instead, and it's just fine, like you get used to it. I would say for the first 5 minutes it felt awkward, and after that it was just fine. Now the L2 and R2 buttons are awkwardly placed, but really there's no other place to put them. I wish they were a little bit more clicky. They're really kind of mushy, but I don't see myself using these buttons very often. And the icing on the cake is this wooden case. Not only does it look cool, like it's something I could put on a shelf or something else like that, but it fits the Game Boy Advance perfectly. To me, I consider this customized Game Boy Advance to be a collector's item. It's obvious when you pay $175 for something like this, you're not going for the best bang for your buck. You're trying to buy something that's unique and special, and this wooden case just really pushes it over the edge like that. This is something I'm going to treasure for the rest of my adult life. And this wooden case allows me to preserve that treasure for even longer. Okay, let's start wrapping things up. And like I do with any review, I'm going to talk about what I like and what I don't like. So what I like is that it has a beautiful, crisp display. Every single system that's supported on here looks beautiful on this device, and I don't have to mess with any of the settings in order to make it work. I can't overstate how naturally beautiful everything looks when you're playing on this device. And performance is pretty great. Like, Nintendo 64 and below are basically excellent. There are several games that play better on this than they do on an RG351 device. Nintendo 64 can be hit or miss. You really are going to have to experiment around with those. But when it comes down to it, I'm really impressed with the amount of games that I can play with this device. Even though I'm new to the whole RetroPie thing, I really like the interface. I mean, it's Emulation Station, but then you can also get in there and change some unique settings within it. And overall, this device is a pleasure to hold. It's always been a pleasure to hold. I mean, this thing has been around for 30 years at this point. But in 2021, it's still a lot of fun to have. This device is a unique mixture of familiar and nostalgic, of classic and modern. When I pick this thing up, it feels like it came from the 90s, but then when I put my fingers on the buttons, I'm like, oh man, this is better than I remember. And you know, there's a lot of people who are really into modding Game Boy and things like that, and I'm kind of turning into a believer, right? Like, I really like this idea of taking this original device and upgrading it. And if you don't have the time or the skill set to mod your own Game Boy Advance, I really appreciate that the people behind myretrogamecase.com are selling these already pre-configured. And if you are interested in actually modding it yourself, they actually sell these kits unassembled. You just have to send them an email and they'll take care of it for you. Now, as much as I love this thing, I always like to talk about the things I don't like. So here's what I don't like. One, it has a pretty short battery life. I think you get about 2 or 3 hours out of these batteries, but luckily they're rechargeable and upgradable, so it's not a huge deal. And like I mentioned before, the controls are fairly crowded just from the fact that they had to use the original case when modding it. And like we saw, there are some issues with overheating. I'm not sure how hot it's actually getting, but it's still annoying to have that thermometer pop up all the time. And then I'm not a fan of these L2 and R2 buttons. I don't think there's anything we can do to get around that. At the end of the day, the question that you probably are asking, and the question that I think anyone should ask when they're reviewing a new device, is whether or not this is worth $175. And I think that if you're a collector, or if you're somebody who used to have a Game Boy Advance and you have like a lot of nostalgia about the device, but you want to ensure that it's going to last for a long time to come, I think this is something worth considering. The fact that it has these replaceable rechargeable batteries, and it has a modern control scheme that'll allow you to play different systems from different eras. I think when it all adds up, it's definitely worth $175 if this is something that's important to you. If you just want to play retro games on a handheld device, this isn't the device for you. You can find cheap Chinese devices for way less than this, half the price. But that's not really the point of this, is it? At the end of the day, if you're only going to buy one handheld device, this probably isn't the one you should buy. I would say get an RG351P. But if you've already got some of those devices and you're just looking for something that you really want to be proud of that'll give you joy when you open it up, this customized Game Boy Advance is really hitting the mark for me. Okay everyone, that's it for this video. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you staying and watching through the end. To me, this is a unique video because it's not me reviewing some device that's available for purchase. I'm really reviewing the experience I had when I was playing this thing. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.